In this lesson, we'll begin our examination of the vector graphic tools provided in Adobe Photoshop CS6. Now, we must note at this point that Photoshop is primarily a bitmap editing software. So it is not designed to cater primarily for vector graphics. However, it does have a group of tools that can be used to that end. Usually, if you were going to get involved in vector graphic production at a professional scale, you could use Photoshop to an extent, but you would want to learn something like Illustrator or Inkscape because those are dedicated vector graphic programs. So that said, everything between this gray line and this gray line deals with vector graphics or some form of vector data in Photoshop. So these are all of your tools for that. In the first drop down we have pen tool, freeform pen tool, add anchor point tool, delete anchor point tool, and convert tool. Next we have the text tools, horizontal, vertical, horizontal type mask, and vertical type mask tools. Path selection, direct selection, and finally rectangle tool, rounded rectangle, elliptical or ellipse tool, polygon, line, and custom shape tool. Okay, so I've preloaded an image of Garfield. I'm sure you know him, and I'm just going to demonstrate one of the simple uses of the pen tool. Now, looking up here on the options pane or the options bar, we can see that we have a number of criteria that we can configure. We can change between shape and path here. So what's the difference? Well, a path doesn't render anything, it just defines the area of an object. So you can see that I'm getting this gray line here that's sort of helping to define the area of Garfield, but there's nothing filling in between it. So while I can see this little gray line just to help me mark him out, so as the designer you've got to be able to see where your path is going. So that's just like an aid to the designer in Photoshop. While I can see that, that would not appear in the final image. You can see that, for instance, in the navigator. So in the navigator preview, there's no path. But the shape is what's rendered from the path with a color value of some kind or a gradient or whatever type of fill you're using. Okay, so that's kind of the difference really between the path and the shape. The shape is the extant version of the path. The path defines the shape, but the shape is what you actually see as, you know, your end product. Okay. So how can we use the pen tool to mark out the shape? We'll go back to shape here of Garfield. Well, we'll set our stroke to be black because he has a black stroke, and we'll set the fill to be some kind of a yellow maybe. We can of course change this later, so this is just rough. Okay. And what we're going to do is follow the contours as closely as possible, placing new anchors. Each point that you place is called an anchor. So I'll start at this corner, and I'll place one here, and then I'll drag as I place it to create the curve. So this is called a Bezier curve. Okay. This needs to come down. Stroke thickness was too high. Okay. Now I'm not going to follow the exact contours in this image because it would just take a little too long. Instead, I'm going to do an approximate version. Okay, so we need to further subdivide There we go. It's a little better. Let's zoom in so we can see a little more closely what it is that we're doing here. Okay. It should be pretty clear at this point anyhow that the pen tool is for marking out points which define a shape. So what if I want to come back to one of these other points and edit them once they've already been placed? Well, we can do that with the direct selection tool. So if I grab this point, for instance, I can edit the Bezier curve with the handles like that. What if I only want to move one handle? Well, I can do that by holding Shift on the key, or Alt I should say, on the keyboard to move, say, the right handle independently of the left handle. So let's see that again. I'll grab an anchor point here. Direct selection tool. Click on a point. Okay. So it has to be a point that has curves, of course. This point has curves. So say I want to move this left handle independently. By default they move together. They stay like a straight line. If you want to move it independently, you have to hold Alt and then drag it like that to further alter the shape. So using the pen tool and the direct selection tool, we can come in and we can define define the shape of an object and then further refine that defined shape. So the refining of the shape really comes down to the direct selection tool, because you can go back and select anchor points you've already placed and improve on those. So you'll notice I've come back to the pen tool and I've clicked on the last anchor point to begin creating my lines again. I'll undo that and do it again, just so nothing is lost here. Okay. The key to getting these shapes correct is to click and not release, but to drag again, like this, immediately. Now obviously this is not going to be perfect right off the bat, but what we're going to do is come back in with the direct selection tool and using that Alt key that we learned about, we can move each handle independently to refine the shape. So we can't do that while we're placing with the pen tool really, but we can do it afterwards as an edit. Okay, what I'll do is I'll just finish off the leg, because we don't want this lesson to go on forever, do we? I'm going to drop the fill on this layer so we can see underneath. Okay. You can always undo the placement of an anchor by either pressing Ctrl Z or Ctrl Alt Z if you need to do multiple undos. Just click on the last anchor point to begin placing from there again. Okay, and that's our rough shape created. And again, if there's anything that seems a little bit off, then you can come in with the direct selection tool and start manipulating those anchor points. Direct selection tool, which is the white one. Okay. So in our next lesson we'll take a look at the freeform pen tool. and we might also explore some more of these options at the options bar. But we've already explored the basics, haven't we? So the path defines the shape. The shape is what actually renders to the screen. The fill, obviously, is the fill color in between here. The stroke is the border around it. We could change the stroke thickness here. The stroke style can be altered there. And that's really all you need to know. So that is the pen tool and the basics of vectors covered. One other point, I guess, is that you can fill with more than just a solid color. You can use gradients. So I could come in here if I wanted to and use some kind of gradient. Now that actually slightly works because the original image here uses blends of orange and yellow, and this gradient here is using blends of orange and yellow. So that's basic vector graphic theory. I might just throw in there that because the vector graphic is defined by this mathematical path with anchors and curves and handles and everything else, that means this image is infinitely scalable. So that's why vector graphics are so popular in the games industry and in illustration and in so many industries now, because one, they're clean and simple, they're easy to edit later, it's non-destructive editing. So that's key. It's non-destructive editing at the core, really. And it's infinitely scalable up and down. That's not true of pixel data, as you should know at this point. If you scale a pixel image down and up again, it's going to get very blurry and you're going to lose a lot of detail. That doesn't happen with vector graphics. So that's the real benefit to vector graphics. What you lose with vector graphics is high fidelity or high detail. Instead, you have these kind of solid colors or gradients, and it lends itself more to cartoonish design. Great. In the next lesson, we'll look at the freeform pen tool.